There's something almost mythological about a man who was given up for adoption, dropped out of college, got fired from his own company, and then returned to transform not just one industry but 6: personal computers, animated movies, music, phones, tablets, and digital publishing. This is the story of Steve Jobs, a man whose vision, passion, and relentless pursuit of perfection changed how billions of people live, work, and communicate. Our story begins on February 24, 1955, in San Francisco, California. Steve Jobs was born to Joanne Schiebel, a graduate student, and Abdel Fattah Jandali, a Syrian political science professor. They were unmarried, and Joanne's conservative Catholic family disapproved of the relationship. Facing family pressure and uncertain about their future, they made the difficult decision to put their baby up for adoption. The adoption had conditions. Joanne insisted that the adoptive parents be college-educated and promised to send the child to college. The first couple chosen backed out when they learned the baby was a boy. They wanted a girl. The baby was then offered to Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple in Mountain View, California. Paul Jobs was a machinist and carpenter, a man who worked with his hands and understood how things were built. Clara was an accountant. Neither had college degrees, which nearly derailed the adoption. Joanne initially refused to sign the papers. Only when Paul and Clara promised in writing that they would ensure the boy attended college did she relent. This beginning would haunt Steve throughout his life. The knowledge that he was given up, that he wasn't wanted by his biological parents, created a wound that never fully healed. It drove him to prove himself, to show the world he was special, to create things so extraordinary that no one could reject or abandon them. The need to be chosen, to be wanted, would fuel both his greatest achievements and his most difficult personal relationships. Paul Jobs became a formative influence on young Steve. He was a craftsman who believed that even parts of a product people never saw should be made perfectly. When building a fence or a cabinet, Paul insisted that the back, the parts hidden from view, should be finished as carefully as the front. "You have to make the back of the fence just as good-looking as the front," he told Steve. "Even though nobody will see it, you will know, and that will show that you're dedicated to making something perfect." This philosophy would become central to Steve's approach to product design. Apple products would be engineered beautifully inside, even though most users would never open them. The commitment to craftsmanship, to excellence in every detail, came directly from those early lessons in Paul Jobs' garage. The Jobs family lived in Mountain View, in what would become known as Silicon Valley, though it wasn't called that yet in the 1950s and 60s. The area was transforming from agricultural land to the center of the emerging electronics industry. Engineers from companies like Hewlett-Packard, Fairchild Semiconductor, and others were moving into the neighborhood, and young Steve absorbed the culture of innovation and technology that surrounded him. But Steve was a difficult child. He was smart, intensely so, and he knew it. He was bored in school, acted out, and showed little patience for authority or rules that seemed arbitrary. His fourth-grade teacher, Imogene Hill, recognized his intelligence and bribed him with candy and money to complete his work. It worked. Steve skipped fifth grade entirely, jumping ahead academically. This early acceleration had consequences. Steve was always younger than his classmates, always trying to prove himself intellectually while being less mature socially. The pattern of being the smartest person in the room but struggling with relationships and social norms would repeat throughout his life. As a teenager, Steve met Bill Fernandez, who introduced him to Steve Wozniak, a brilliant engineer 5 years older who shared Steve's passion for electronics and pranks. Wozniak, or Woz, as everyone called him, was a technical genius who could build almost anything. Steve Jobs wasn't an engineer in the same way, but he understood what technology could do, what people might want, and how to push engineers to create things they didn't think were possible. Their first collaboration was the Blue Box, a device that could trick phone systems into providing free long-distance calls. This was illegal, of course, but it taught them something crucial. They could build technology that had real power, that could challenge established systems, and that people would want. Years later, Steve would say, "If it hadn't been for the Blue Boxes, there wouldn't have been an Apple." Steve enrolled at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, in 1972, fulfilling his adoptive parents' promise to his biological mother. But he dropped out after just one semester. The tuition was draining his working-class parents' savings, and Steve couldn't see the value in required courses that didn't interest him. However, he didn't leave Portland. Instead, he hung around Reed for another 18 months, sleeping on friends' floors, returning Coke bottles for food money, and auditing classes that fascinated him. One of those classes was calligraphy. Steve became entranced by the art of beautiful lettering, studying serif and sans serif typefaces, the spacing between letters, and what made great typography. It seemed completely impractical, unconnected to any career path. But a decade later, when designing the Macintosh, Steve would insist on beautiful fonts and proportional spacing, making the Mac the first personal computer with typography that rivaled professional printing. "If I had never dropped in on that single calligraphy course in college," he later said, "the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts." During this period, Steve also explored spirituality, particularly Zen Buddhism and Eastern philosophy. He experimented with LSD, which he would later describe as one of the most important experiences of his life. He traveled to India seeking enlightenment, returning months later with his head shaved, wearing traditional Indian clothing, and deeply influenced by Buddhist ideas about intuition, simplicity, and the pursuit of enlightenment through practice. These experiences, the calligraphy, the Buddhism, the psychedelics, might seem disconnected from technology and business. But they shaped Steve's aesthetic sensibility, his belief that technology should be beautiful and intuitive, his conviction that simplicity was the ultimate sophistication. While other computer companies were run by engineers focused purely on technical specifications, Steve was developing a vision of technology as art, as something that should delight and inspire. In 1974, Steve took a job at Atari, the video game company, as a technician. He was terrible at it in conventional terms, abrasive with colleagues, dismissive of others' ideas, and convinced he was smarter than everyone around him. Atari's founder, Nolan Bushnell, eventually moved Steve to the night shift because other employees couldn't stand working with him. But Bushnell also recognized something special in Steve, a vision and intensity that could be valuable if properly channeled. Steve convinced Atari to send him to India, ostensibly to work on a project but really to fund his spiritual seeking. When he returned, he reconnected with Wozniak, who had been working at Hewlett-Packard and, in his spare time, designing a computer. This is where our story truly begins. In 1975, the personal computer didn't really exist. Computers were massive machines owned by corporations, universities, and government agencies. But a hobbyist movement was emerging, people building their own computers from kits, sharing designs, imagining a future where individuals might own computers. Wozniak had designed something remarkable, a computer that could be built affordably, that could display text on a regular TV screen, and that was simple enough for hobbyists to assemble. He showed it to Steve, expecting appreciation for the elegant engineering. Steve saw something entirely different. He saw a product. He saw a business. He saw the future. "We should start a company," Steve told Woz. "We should sell these." Wozniak was skeptical. He was happy at HP, had a good salary, and enjoyed building computers as a hobby. Why risk that for an uncertain business venture? Steve was relentless. He pushed, cajoled, and painted a vision of what they could build together. Even if they failed, Steve argued, they'd have the experience of starting a company. Finally, Wozniak agreed. On April 1, 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple Computer Company in Paul Jobs' garage. Steve was 21 years old. They named it Apple partly because Steve had just returned from a commune where he'd worked in the apple orchards, and partly because Apple would appear before Atari in the phone book. Their first product, the Apple I, was really just a circuit board. Buyers had to supply their own case, keyboard, and monitor. It was a hobbyist product, and they sold about 200 units at $666.66 each. But Steve was already imagining something bigger. The Apple II, released in 1977, was revolutionary. It was a complete computer in a sleek plastic case, with color graphics, expansion slots, and the potential to run sophisticated software. Most importantly, it looked friendly and approachable, not like an intimidating piece of industrial equipment. Steve insisted on the design, the packaging, even the look of the circuit boards inside, applying his father's lesson about craftsmanship in hidden places. The Apple II became phenomenally successful, one of the first mass-market personal computers. It launched the personal computer revolution and made Apple a major company. By 1980, when Apple went public, Steve Jobs, at age 25, was worth over $200 million. But success brought challenges. Apple was growing rapidly, hiring professional managers and engineers, becoming a real corporation. Steve was the visionary, the public face, the one who pushed for excellence in design. But he was also increasingly difficult to work with, demanding, insulting, prone to what colleagues called his reality distortion field, where he would insist impossible things were possible and somehow convince people he was right. In 1979, Steve visited Xerox PARC, the legendary research center where many future technologies were being developed. What he saw there would change everything. Computers with graphical user interfaces, with windows, icons, and a mouse. Instead of typing commands, users could point and click. It was intuitive, visual, revolutionary. Steve immediately recognized that this was the future of computing. Xerox had invented it but didn't understand its significance. Steve did. He would later say, they were copierheads. They had no clue about what they had. Apple would take these ideas and turn them into products. This led to the Macintosh project. Steve envisioned a computer for ordinary people, not just hobbyists or businesses. It would be friendly, beautiful, and so intuitive that anyone could use it. He recruited a team of brilliant engineers and designers, pushed them mercilessly, and created a culture that was both intensely creative and often brutal. The stories from this period are legendary. Steve would call ideas shit one day and brilliant the next. He would tell engineers their work was terrible, reducing some to tears, then inspire them to accomplish things they didn't think were possible. He created an environment where excellence was the only acceptable standard, but the cost was high in terms of stress, burnout, and damaged relationships. The Macintosh launched in January 1984 with a famous Super Bowl commercial directed by Ridley Scott. The ad showed a woman throwing a sledgehammer at a Big Brother figure on a screen, representing IBM. On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. The Mac was brilliant in many ways, beautifully designed, with groundbreaking software and an intuitive interface. But it was also expensive, underpowered for many business applications, and incompatible with most existing software. Initial sales were strong, driven by curiosity and Apple's marketing, but then they slowed. Meanwhile, tensions were building within Apple. Steve was running the Macintosh division like his own company within the company, competing with other Apple divisions and alienating executives. John Sculley, whom Steve had recruited from Pepsi to be Apple's CEO with the famous line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" was increasingly concerned about Steve's management style. In 1985, the conflict came to a head. The board of directors had to choose between Steve and Sculley. They chose Sculley. At age 30, Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple, the company he had co-founded and built. The dismissal was devastating. Steve was publicly humiliated, rejected by the company that bore his vision, fired from his life's work. He fell into a depression, considered leaving the technology industry entirely, and spent months wandering, trying to figure out what to do next. But Steve Jobs wasn't done. In fact, the next chapter of his life would prove crucial to his ultimate success. He founded Next Computer, envisioning workstations for universities and researchers. The Next computers were beautiful, with cube-shaped cases and sophisticated software, but they were expensive and found limited market success. However, the Next operating system was sophisticated and powerful, and the development tools were ahead of their time. Steve also bought a small computer graphics division from Lucasfilm for $10 million. The company was called Pixar. Initially, Steve saw it as a hardware company selling high-end graphics computers. But the team had other ideas. They wanted to make animated films. Steve was skeptical but supported their work. Pixar created short films to demonstrate their technology, and these shorts won awards and acclaim. Eventually, they partnered with Disney to create the first fully computer-animated feature film. In 1995, Toy Story was released. It was a massive critical and commercial success, revolutionizing animated film. When Pixar went public, Steve's investment, which had cost him $50 million over the years as he funded Pixar's losses, was suddenly worth over $1 billion. Steve Jobs, who had been written off as a has-been in the technology world, was now a billionaire and a Hollywood player. But the real transformation was yet to come. By the mid-1990s, Apple was struggling. The company had lost its way after Steve's departure, creating too many products with no clear vision. Market share was declining, and the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. In late 1996, Apple bought Next for $429 million, bringing Steve back as an advisor. Within months, he maneuvered to become interim CEO, then CEO. He was back at Apple, the company that had rejected him, and this time he had control. What Steve did next demonstrated everything he'd learned during his exile. He ruthlessly cut Apple's product line from dozens of products to just 4, a desktop and laptop for consumers, and a desktop and laptop for professionals. He focused the company's energy on creating great products rather than mediocre ones. He pushed for design excellence, partnering with Johnny Ive, Apple's designer, to create products that were not just functional but beautiful. The iMac, released in 1998, was a translucent, colorful all-in-one computer that looked nothing like the beige boxes dominating the market. It was a hit, and it announced that Apple was back. But Steve was thinking even bigger. In 2001, Apple released the iPod, a music player that held thousands of songs and was beautifully designed and easy to use. 1,000 songs in your pocket, the ads proclaimed. The iPod was successful, but the real revolution came in 2003 with the iTunes Store. Steve convinced major record labels to sell individual songs for 99 cents each, legally and easily. This was revolutionary. The music industry had been devastated by illegal file sharing, but the labels were fragmented and couldn't agree on a legal alternative. Steve unified them, creating a legal way to buy digital music that was actually more convenient than pirating. The combination of iPod and iTunes transformed the music industry. Apple sold hundreds of millions of iPods and billions of songs. More importantly, it demonstrated that Apple could succeed beyond computers, that Steve's vision extended across industries. In 2007, Steve announced the iPhone. Many people don't remember how radical it seemed at the time. Phones had physical keyboards. The industry was dominated by Nokia, Motorola, and BlackBerry. The idea of a phone that was primarily a touchscreen, with no physical keyboard, seemed risky. But Steve had a vision, a phone that was actually a pocket computer, with a beautiful screen, intuitive touch interface, and the ability to run sophisticated software. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone, Steve announced. He wasn't exaggerating. The iPhone revolutionized mobile computing. It created the smartphone industry as we know it today. It destroyed Nokia, Motorola, and BlackBerry. It changed how billions of people communicate, access information, take photos, navigate, and live their daily lives. It's arguably the most successful and influential product in consumer electronics history. In 2010, Apple released the iPad, creating the tablet computer market. Critics initially dismissed it as just a big iPhone, but Steve understood that the form factor enabled different uses: reading, drawing, presenting, and consuming media in ways that worked better on a tablet than on a phone or laptop. By this time, Steve Jobs was recognized as one of the most successful business leaders in history. He had transformed multiple industries. Apple had become the most valuable technology company in the world. The products Steve envisioned had changed how billions of people lived. But there was a shadow over these triumphs. In 2003, Steve had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He initially tried to treat it with alternative medicine, diet changes, and spiritual approaches, delaying surgery for 9 months. This decision would later haunt him. By the time he had surgery, the cancer may have spread. Steve kept his illness largely private, appearing publicly even as his health deteriorated. His appearance became increasingly gaunt, but he continued working, continued pushing Apple forward, continued introducing new products. The man who revolutionized computing was fighting a battle he couldn't win through force of will or vision. Cancer didn't care about his reality distortion field, his ability to convince people that impossible things were possible. It progressed despite his determination. In 2011, Steve resigned as Apple's CEO, handing control to Tim Cook. On October 5, 2011, at age 56, Steve Jobs died. The outpouring of grief was global and unprecedented for a business leader. People left flowers and candles at Apple stores worldwide. Competitors and rivals offered tributes. Presidents and prime ministers issued statements. It was clear that Steve had touched something deeper than business success. He had shaped culture, changed how people lived, and inspired millions with his vision of what technology could be. But Steve Jobs' legacy is more complex than the hagiographic tributes suggest. He was brilliant and cruel, visionary and petty, capable of inspiring devotion and causing deep pain. His treatment of people was often terrible. He denied paternity of his daughter Lisa for years, despite DNA evidence, causing her and her mother tremendous suffering. He finally acknowledged Lisa and they reconciled, but the damage was done. His first family suffered from his absence and emotional unavailability. At work, he could be viciously insulting. He regularly told people their work was shit, made employees cry, and created an environment of fear alongside inspiration. Some people who worked with Steve describe it as the best experience of their careers. Others describe it as traumatic. His approach to philanthropy was essentially non-existent during his lifetime. Unlike Bill Gates, who dedicated billions to global health and poverty, Steve showed little interest in charitable giving. He eliminated Apple's corporate philanthropy programs when he returned as CEO, arguing the company needed to focus on profitability. He was obsessed with control, with perfection, with having things exactly his way. This created great products but also closed systems, proprietary technologies, and limited choices for users. The debate over whether Apple's closed ecosystem is protective or restrictive continues today. Yet Steve's contributions to the world are undeniable. He didn't invent the personal computer, the graphical interface, the music player, the smartphone, or the tablet. But he understood better than anyone how to make these technologies accessible, beautiful, and desirable to ordinary people. His insistence on design excellence raised standards across the technology industry. His ability to simplify complex technology into intuitive interfaces made computing accessible to billions who would never master command-line interfaces or technical manuals. His vision of technology as something that should enhance human creativity and connection, not just process data, shaped the industry's direction. The intersection of technology and liberal arts, which Steve spoke about often, was central to his philosophy. He believed that great products came from combining technical excellence with artistic sensibility, that engineers and designers needed to work together, that functionality without beauty was insufficient. This philosophy produced the Macintosh's beautiful typography, the iPod's scroll wheel, the iPhone's multi-touch interface, and the iPad's simplicity. It influenced designers and engineers throughout the industry, raising expectations for what consumer technology should be. Steve's presentation style also changed business communication. His product launches became legendary performances, carefully choreographed to build excitement and clearly communicate why products mattered. One more thing, his signature phrase before revealing a surprise announcement became iconic. Business leaders across industries studied and copied his presentation techniques. The Apple stores, which Steve pushed for despite board skepticism, revolutionized retail. They became destinations with their distinctive glass staircases, wooden tables, and genius bars. They demonstrated that retail could be experiential, that stores could be community spaces, and that customer service could be a differentiator. Steve's ability to say no was as important as his vision of what to create. Apple under his leadership focused on a small number of products and executed them brilliantly rather than creating many mediocre products. This focus was countercultural in an industry that believed success came from offering maximum choice and features. His famous statement that, "People don't know what they want until you show it to them," reflected his approach. Apple didn't do focus groups or market research in the traditional sense. Steve believed that truly innovative products created their own markets, that you couldn't ask customers what they wanted because they couldn't imagine possibilities they'd never seen. This approach produced revolutionary products but also notable failures. The Newton, Apple's early attempt at a personal digital assistant, was too far ahead of the technology. The Cube, a beautiful but expensive desktop computer, found few buyers. Apple TV initially struggled to find its market. Not every vision succeeded, but the successes so dramatically outweighed the failures that Steve's approach vindicated itself. The iPod, iPhone, and iPad didn't emerge from market research. They emerged from Steve's vision of what technology could and should be, combined with Apple's ability to execute that vision with excellence. The relationship between Steve and Bill Gates, his longtime rival, was complex and revealing. They were competitors who needed each other. Microsoft's software ran on Apple's hardware in the early days, and Apple's innovations pushed Microsoft to improve Windows. They respected each other's abilities while disagreeing fundamentally about approach. Gates built an empire on ubiquity and compatibility. Windows ran on many manufacturers' hardware, creating a platform that dominated through availability and affordability. Steve built an empire on integration and excellence. Apple controlled hardware and software, creating products that worked seamlessly together but only within Apple's ecosystem. The debates about which approach was better, open versus closed, compatibility versus integration, continue today in forms both would recognize. Android versus iOS echoes the earlier Mac versus Windows debates, with similar arguments about freedom, control, user experience, and market dominance. Steve's connection to Pixar is sometimes overshadowed by his Apple achievements, but it's crucial to understanding him completely. At Pixar, Steve learned patience. Animated films take years to produce, and rushing them produces failures. He learned to trust creative people and give them space to work, lessons that influenced how he worked with designers at Apple. He also learned about storytelling. Pixar's success came from emotional resonance, from creating characters and narratives that moved audiences. This understanding influenced how Steve presented products, framing them not as technical specifications but as tools for human creativity and connection. When Disney bought Pixar for $7.4 billion in 2006, Steve became Disney's largest individual shareholder and joined its board of directors. His influence on Disney's strategic direction, particularly its focus on animation and Pixar's creative culture, was significant. The next years, often seen as Steve's wilderness period, were actually crucial to his development as a leader. The failures taught him humility, the limitations of vision without execution, the importance of market fit. The successes, particularly the next operating system and development tools, became the foundation of OS X and iOS. Without being fired from Apple, without the humbling experience of next struggles, without learning from failure, Steve might never have developed the wisdom necessary to lead Apple's resurrection. As he said in his famous Stanford commencement speech, "Getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me." That Stanford speech, delivered in 2005, is worth considering carefully. Steve spoke about connecting dots, looking backward, about love and loss, about death as life's change agent. "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life," he said. "Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice." This philosophy drove Steve's life, the conviction that following your intuition and passion mattered more than convention or others' expectations. It produced his greatest achievements and his greatest failures, his most beautiful creations and his most damaged relationships. The question of what to make of Steve Jobs ultimately depends on what we value. If we prioritize innovation, design excellence, and products that change the world, he's a visionary whose contributions are immeasurable. If we prioritize how leaders treat people, personal relationships, and social responsibility, he's a more troubling figure whose behavior often conflicted with stated values. Most likely, both are true simultaneously. Steve Jobs was capable of extraordinary vision and terrible treatment of people, of inspiring devotion and causing deep pain, of creating products that enhanced billions of lives while neglecting his own family and relationships. The technologies Steve championed, personal computers, digital music, smartphones, tablets, have transformed society in ways both wonderful and concerning. We're more connected but also more distracted, more productive but also more surveilled, more empowered but also more dependent on devices and platforms. These paradoxes aren't Steve's fault specifically, but they emerge from the revolution he led. Technology is never neutral. The choices designers and engineers make shape how we live. Steve understood this and took those choices seriously, even if the outcomes are more complex than he anticipated. Walking through an Apple store today, using an iPhone, listening to music through AirPods, we're experiencing Steve Jobs' vision made tangible. The clean design, the intuitive interfaces, the integration between devices, the attention to detail in packaging and presentation, all of it traces back to a man who insisted that technology should be beautiful, that ordinary people deserved extraordinary design, that excellence in every detail mattered. The circuit boards inside devices that users would never see are still crafted with care, honoring Paul Jobs' lesson about the back of the fence. The typography in Apple's software reflects calligraphy classes at Reed College. The simplicity reflects Buddhist influence. The integration reflects his belief that controlling the whole widget produced better experiences. Steve Jobs didn't work alone. Wozniak's engineering, Ives' design, countless engineers and designers contributed to Apple's products. But Steve provided the vision, the drive, the insistence on excellence that made extraordinary work possible and necessary. His reality distortion field, that ability to convince people that impossible things were possible, was both gift and curse. It inspired people to achieve things they didn't think they could, and it allowed Steve to deny uncomfortable truths about his health, his relationships, and his impact on people around him. As we reach the end of Steve's story, what stands out most powerfully is the intensity of his belief that great work was possible, that technology could be art, that changing the world through extraordinary products was a worthy life's pursuit. This conviction drove him to achievements few could match and sacrifices few should emulate. The boy given up for adoption, always trying to prove he was special, created products that hundreds of millions of people chose, wanted, and loved. The college dropout who studied calligraphy transformed computing's aesthetics. The spiritual seeker who traveled to India brought ideas about simplicity and intuition to technology design. The man fired from his own company returned to build it into one of the world's most valuable. From a garage in Los Altos to keynotes watched by millions, from the Apple II to the iPhone, from Next's failures to Pixar's triumphs, from exile to resurrection, Steve Jobs' journey contains more transformation, innovation, and drama than seems possible in a single lifetime. Whether he was a genius or a tyrant, a visionary or a narcissist, an artist or a businessman, the answer is that he was all of these things, not in sequence but simultaneously, and the contradictions are inseparable from the achievements. The rectangle of glass and metal in your pocket, responsive to your touch, connected to the world, containing thousands of songs and millions of apps, is Steve Jobs' legacy made physical. For better and worse, for the connection and distraction it enables, for the creativity it empowers and the addiction it creates, this is the world Steve Jobs helped build. And his story, with all its brilliance and cruelty, innovation and pain, vision and blindness, remains endlessly fascinating precisely because it refuses simple interpretation. Steve Jobs changed the world. The cost of that change, to himself and others, was higher than perhaps it should have been. Whether the world he helped create is ultimately better or worse than what came before, whether his methods were justified by his results, these are questions each of us must answer for ourselves. What's beyond question is that Steve Jobs mattered, that his impact on technology, design, and culture will persist for generations, and that his story, the story of an adopted boy who believed he was special, who created beautiful things to prove it, who changed industries to validate that belief, and who died too young after touching billions of lives, deserves to be told, understood, and grappled with in all its complexity.